Every few years, Americans rediscover a certain fantasy. A federal government so small, so cheap, and so hands-off that it barely touches daily life. We've tried this before. In 1812, that tiny government was supposed to defend the country against the world's largest empire. It didn't go well. And when the smoke cleared, the old ideology was in ruins. Not because people abandoned their principles, but because reality forced their hand. What followed was one of the most dramatic ideological reversals in U.S. history. The generation raised on Jeffersonian suspicion of power became the architects of a nationalist, state-driven economic order. This chapter is the story of how that happened. What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is another episode of How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the previous episode, I discussed Chapter 2 of Charles Sellers' The Market Revolution, Jacksonian America, 1815 to 1846. I'm going to continue the path that I mentioned I would go on for the next few weeks by discussing Chapter 3 of that same book, The Market Revolution, by Charles Sellers. So that's what I'm going to cover in this episode. But of course, that is not the only source of information that I'm going to be using to cover what is going on in this period. I will also, as usual, be using the American Pageant, which is a common AP US history textbook. I will also be referring to Give Me Liberty, which is another common AP/college US history textbook. And I will be using the book in the Oxford History of the United States series that covers this period. The books I have been using from other periods were Empire of Liberty and The Glorious Cause. This book that covers the 1815 to roughly 1848 period is What Hath God Wrought? And it is by Daniel Walker Howe. So those are the resources I'll be using, and as usual, I'll give you folks a question to think about as I'm going through all this information that I think will help you to kind of organize your thoughts and take everything in a little bit more effectively. So here is that question. How did the nation-building policies of political figures like John Calhoun, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams combine with the nationalist agenda of the Supreme Court and the territorial expansion of Andrew Jackson to usher in the era of a more vigorous and authoritative federal government after 1815? I'll say that one more time. How did the nation-building policies of political figures like John Calhoun, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams combine with the nationalist agenda of the Supreme Court and the territorial expansion of Andrew Jackson to usher in the era of a more vigorous and more authoritative federal government in the years after 1815. So if you keep that in mind, if you're thinking about that big picture-wise as I go through this stuff, I think it'll all click a little bit better. Without further ado, here we go. By the time the War of 1812 ended, the United States stood at a crossroads. The subsistence world that Charles Sellers described in Chapter 1 had already begun to erode under the weight of new laws, charters, banks, and infrastructure projects, as we saw in the discussion of Chapter 2. The land crunch I discussed in Chapter 1 was also in full effect, and the economics of both subsistence farming and running a small artisanal workshop were becoming more and more harrowing. Now, in Chapter 3, Sellers shifts focus to the political embrace of evolving toward a market economy. He shows how a new generation of Republican leaders, men like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, transformed the Jeffersonian tradition of small government and agrarian independence into a muscular program of nationalism and economic development. This transformation did not emerge from nowhere. It was the direct product of war, commerce, and political ambition. The result was a decisive turn. What began as a party founded on resistance to Hamiltonian capitalism evolved into the very engine of a new market order that, to a large degree, embraced the Hamiltonian philosophy it had once rejected. The War of 1812 exposed the fragility of Jeffersonian minimalism. The tiny federal government built on low taxes, and a skeletal army and navy had proven incapable of defending the Republic against Great Britain. South Carolinian John Calhoun, already a leader of the Warhawks who had pushed Madison into the War of 1812, emerged as one of the most vocal proponents of a sweeping nationalist agenda in the war's aftermath. Calhoun argued that if the nation was to survive and thrive, it needed far more than subsistence farmers and lofty rhetoric about independence. It required the tools of state power: a standing army of 10,000 men, a strengthened navy to guard America's coasts and commerce, and a federal government capable of raising taxes, revenue to sustain those things. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House from Kentucky, joined Calhoun in promoting what he would later call the American system, a package of internal improvements, tariffs, and banking reform that would bind the nation together economically and politically. The centerpiece of this new program was the Second Bank of the United States, chartered in 1816. Unlike the scattered state banks that issued unstable paper currencies, the Bank of the U.S. offered a uniform medium of exchange and provided a stable base for government borrowing. Though many Republicans recognized this as a Hamiltonian measure and admitted as much, they defended it as necessary for national strength. Sellers emphasizes the irony. Men who had once denounced Hamilton now embraced his tools, repurposed in the name of Republican growth. Financing this ambitious agenda required money, and that meant taxes. Always a fraught issue in American politics. Since the Revolution, resistance to taxation had been a core part of American identity, especially among rural yeomen who rarely had access to cash and who formed the basis of the Jeffersonian Republican Party. Jeffersonian Republicans had risen to power on promises of low taxes and minimal government. Now, Republicans reversed course. Wartime taxes were maintained, and in 1816, Congress passed the Dallas Tariff, named after Secretary of the Treasury Alexander J. Dallas. This was the first tariff in U.S. history designed explicitly as a protective tariff rather than simply a revenue measure, as were the tariffs from the Hamiltonian regime during Washington's presidency. Its aim, the tariff, was to shield infant American industries, especially textiles, from a flood of cheap British imports that followed the war. For Republican nationalists, the tariff represented a pragmatic departure from Jeffersonian orthodoxy. For many voters, however, it was an uncomfortable reminder that government power came with costs. Sellers stresses that this embrace of taxation and tariffs marked a clear departure from the agrarian ideal of a tiny federal government. Another pillar of the nationalist agenda was infrastructure. Calhoun introduced his bonus bill of 1817, which proposed using federal revenue from the Bank of the U.S. to fund a national network of roads and canals. His argument was straightforward. Infrastructure would knit the country together, and the sections of the country that had so many reasons not to be united together would come together as a result of being more likely to interact with one another through this proposed infrastructure. This would also, in Calhoun's opinion, secure national defense and expand economic opportunity, not just for yeoman farmers, but for planters as well. But here, Republicans ran into constitutional headwinds. Madison, though sympathetic to internal improvements, he saw the wisdom in it, vetoed the bonus bill on his last day in office, insisting that Congress lacked the constitutional authority to fund such projects. President Monroe would later repeat the same position, insisting that a constitutional amendment was necessary in order to allow for the federal government to take such an active role in constructing infrastructure projects. The new generation of leadership had little patience for this perspective, though, as both Calhoun and Clay, among others, thought this was needless hand-wringing over what they thought of as a clearly valid constitutional prerogative. The result was that most improvements fell to the states, as I described in Chapter 2. I went over the noteworthy example of the Erie Canal, funded and constructed entirely by the state of New York because the feds wouldn't step in. But Sellers underlines how revealing this conflict over federal authority to build infrastructure was. Even as Republicans embraced Hamiltonian measures, they continued to be hemmed in by Jeffersonian constitutional scruples. So it's a question of ideology, I would call it idealism, over practicality. The tension between nationalist ambition and constitutional literalism would define debates for years to come. On the other hand, while presidents hesitated, the Supreme Court under John Marshall pushed decisively in favor of nationalism and the market. Several landmark cases in this period redefined the relationship between states, corporations, and federal power. The first of which is Martin versus Hunter's Lessee in 1816. This case grew out of a Virginia land dispute, but its broader significance was in establishing the Supreme Court's authority to review state court decisions on constitutional issues. Justice Joseph Story's opinion made clear that state sovereignty could not override federal treaties or national law, and that the Constitution was not a compact among equal states, but a new national government whose authority exceeded the states because it was ratified directly by the people. This is something that you'll hear a lot of uber states' rights folks mention, that the states predated the national government and that they came together to create the national government, and so therefore the states should have greater rights and power than the national government. But I always kind of want to, frankly, scream at these people, we've been through this shit. It was decided, okay? In the early 1800s, even Madison kind of rejected Jefferson's position on this when Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolution to try to invalidate the Alien and Sedition Acts way back in 1798. So this whole notion that states somehow supersede the federal government has been rejected for a long time in national jurisprudence. Anyway, by asserting the supremacy of the federal government and, by extension, the federal judiciary, the court began to build the foundation of a uniform constitutional order. In the minds of Story, Marshall, and other national jurists, this was a critical step in strengthening the legal framework that underpinned the market revolution. The next big case is McCulloch v. Maryland, which I think I discussed a little bit in the last episode, and that is in 1819, a few years after Martin versus Hunter's Lessee. The court upheld in the McCulloch v. Maryland case the constitutionality of the Bank of the U.S. and denied Maryland's attempt to tax it. Marshall's opinion, in which he remarked that the necessary part of the necessary and proper clause meant only that something was, quote, convenient or useful or essential. And that affirmed the principle of implied powers, giving Congress broad latitude to legislate for the nation's economic welfare. The Marshall Court also reaffirmed the supremacy of the national government by denying the states powers to interfere with it. As Marshall said in the decision, quote, the power to tax involves the power to destroy. Next big case, same year, 1819, Dartmouth College v. Woodward. The court ruled that corporate charters were contracts protected from state interference. A corporate charter was a contract, and contracts protected property and were therefore inviolable. This gave corporations new legal security that had always been suspect since the colonial days, and this legal security emboldened investors, encouraged them to go ahead with starting businesses or investing more money in them when they'd been maybe a little hesitant to do that because they were nervous about their legal rights. Corporations and commerce had even more room to maneuver and grow because of the Dartmouth decision. And then there's Gibbons v. Ogden. Though slightly later, Sellers foreshadows here that Marshall's court would strike down New York's steamboat monopoly after affirming federal authority over interstate commerce. It was another move to establish the dominance of the federal government over the states as part of an overall plan to bind the country together more closely and legitimize the federal government in general. Together, These rulings created what Sellers calls a market constitution, a legal framework that privileged contracts, corporations, and federal supremacy over legal custom and state resistance. Courts, not legislatures, became some of the most powerful architects of the new market order. At the same time Congress and the courts were shaping markets from above, Andrew Jackson and the Army were reshaping them on the ground. Jackson represented the anti-Indian animus of the frontier and could not abide tribal sovereignty, often thinking of and describing Native Americans as savages and heathens. This was the same sentiment expressed by so many whites who often fought with Indians out west. In the aftermath of the Creek War, which overlaps with the War of 1812, it's taking place at the same time in the South, Jackson's victory at Horseshoe Bend, for example, in 1814, forced the Creeks to cede millions of acres in Alabama and Mississippi, which opened up fertile cotton lands in the old Southwest/current Southeast. So this was the Muskogee Indians being forced to sell a bunch of their land basically at the barrel of a gun. Sellers underlines that this was not just military triumph, but economic conquest, creating new opportunities for planters and speculators in this territory that once belonged to Native Americans. You can draw a very straight line between this expansion into Native American territory and the growth of King Cotton, or the Cotton Kingdom, whatever you want to call it, and ultimately slavery. Then there are Jackson's Florida campaigns, which, he pushed into Spanish Florida ostensibly to punish Seminoles and runaway slaves. In practice, he defied orders, seized Spanish forts, and demonstrated America's willingness to use force to secure its borders. To Jackson, this was as much about challenging America's European rivals as asserting dominance over the Indian tribes, because Jackson hated the British almost as much as he hated Native Americans. And then there's what you could call, you're already seeing a part of this, I've talked about it a little bit, Indian Removal 1.0. Even before Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law during his presidency, he spearheaded pushing the Choctaw, Cherokee, Muskogee/Creek, and Chickasaw onto the least desirable lands in the Old Southwest. Jackson forced Indians to sign unfair land agreements that often violated existing treaties with federal and state governments. These campaigns dramatized the link between the Nationalist program and the destruction of Native independence. Military expansion was inseparable from market expansion. Indian lands became the real estate on which the market revolution advanced, as I mentioned a moment ago. This is how the Cotton Kingdom came to be the Cotton Kingdom. Another component of all of this, if Jackson was carving out empire with the sword, John Quincy Adams was doing it with treaties. As Monroe's Secretary of State, Adams pursued an aggressive diplomacy that Sellers sees as central to the Nationalist project. There is, for instance, the Adams-Onís Treaty of 1819. It was negotiated with Spain, and it secured for the United States all of East Florida. The U.S. had gotten control of West Florida in the run-up to the War of 1812, and the Adams-Onís Treaty, the main objective of it was for the United States to get control of East Florida also. In addition to securing Florida, the treaty also defined a transcontinental boundary all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Spain relinquished Florida, as I mentioned, and all of its claims to the Oregon Territory, while the United States recognized Spanish control of Texas officially. Sellers emphasizes how this was not simply a diplomatic nicety, it was a commercial victory, which expanded territory for cotton and slavery while affirming America's ambition to become a continental power. In addition to this, John Quincy Adams was one of the few very respectable politicians who defended what Andrew Jackson did in Florida. When Jackson invaded Florida, which included, as a part of this invasion, seizing Spanish forts and executing British subjects who Jackson insisted were helping Indians fight against the United States. All that stuff that Jackson did risked international scandal and was condemned, as I suggested, by many American politicians, except John Quincy Adams. He turned the tables. He argued that Spain had failed to control its borders, which justified Jackson's actions. And then John Quincy Adams, used the embarrassment of Spain's weakness as leverage in the negotiations over Florida and the new border. What looked like rogue violence became a bargaining chip that delivered Florida to the United States. So what Jackson did actually kind of helped out John Quincy Adams and the Monroe administration. There was also the issue of the northern border with Great Britain. Adams reached agreements with Britain that stabilized that border in the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817. That agreement effectively demilitarized the Great Lakes, limiting naval forces there to a token presence, while the Convention of 1818 established the 49th parallel as the border from the Lake of the Woods, which is in present-day Minnesota and Manitoba/Ontario, out to the Rockies. And it did this treaty, a joint occupation of the Oregon country, because Quincy Adams and his British counterpart couldn't agree on how to divide Puget Sound and Vancouver Island among other territories. These steps reduced the risk of future war and freed resources for westward expansion. You can imagine a scenario where if this negotiation hadn't happened, if this treaty doesn't exist, the United States and Britain are going at each other on the Great Lakes over the U.S.-Canadian border for decades. But this negotiation, the treaties, it put a pin in all that. It basically stopped a source of conflict from becoming something the United States would fight wars about in the future. Adams was as ambitious as Clay and Calhoun, but his tools were diplomatic rather than militaristic or legislative. He secured recognition of U.S. claims to the Oregon country, projecting American sovereignty across the continent. This reflected his larger philosophy that American republicanism would not be safeguarded by retreat, but by expansion, territorially, commercially, and diplomatically. He was one of a few politicians who held on to the notion that one day the United States would absorb Canada and perhaps even Mexico and Cuba. Sellers notes that Adams' foreign policy thinking was already laying the groundwork for what would be the Monroe Doctrine. By emphasizing American independence from European meddling and by projecting U.S. influence across the hemisphere, Adams tied nationalism directly to both market growth and territorial security. So by the early 1820s, national republicanism seemed triumphant. Congress had chartered a bank, passed a protective tariff, and expanded the Army and Navy. The court had upheld federal supremacy. The military had seized Indian lands, and diplomacy had secured Florida and a continental boundary. But Sellers insists that beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. There's issues over taxes and debt, for instance, that he points to. Farmers remained hostile to taxes and very suspicious of banks. There's, of course, sectional interests. Southerners would soon turn against tariffs and internal improvements, with the logic that if the federal government can do those things, can nose its way into those issues, it could eventually come after slavery. There's, of course, native resistance. Expansion came at the cost of dispossession and violence against Native Americans. And there's, of course, slavery itself. The Missouri Crisis of 1820 revealed the sectional fault lines that the Nationalist program could not paper over. In conclusion, Chapter 3 reveals how the era of good feelings was not simply an age of harmony, but a crucial moment in the construction of the market state. Calhoun, Clay, Adams, Monroe built a program of banks, tariffs, armies, and treaties that transformed the Republican Party from agrarian skeptics of markets and industrialization into architects of capitalist expansion. Andrew Jackson's campaigns against Native Americans and Adams's diplomatic triumphs in Florida and elsewhere underscored that this was not just economic development, but also military conquest and territorial aggrandizement. The irony is sharp. What Jefferson had condemned as Hamiltonian monarchy became the very foundation of the Republican nationalism of the 1810s and 1820s. Sellers leaves us with the recognition that the market revolution was not just about canals and contracts, but about power exercised through Congress, courts, armies, and treaties to remake the nation in capitalism's image. So thanks very much for listening as always. I appreciate your time and attention. Please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. It really helps the show. Recommend us to other people. That would be awesome as well. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can at howthehelldowegethherepod@gmail.com, or you can send me a text message or leave me a voicemail at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks again, take care, and I will see y'all next time.